Savannah stood in my entryway at 2:17 in the morning. She held the keys to her luxury SUV like a weapon. Outside, the vehicle sat with a shattered headlight, a dark scrape along the bumper, and a thin, undeniable red mark. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just looked at me and demanded I confess to the hit and run she had just committed. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. My parents, Evelyn and Arthur, pushed past Savannah and stepped into my apartment without an invitation. They did not ask if I was awake, nor did they express concern over the blood on Savannah's bumper. They immediately began orchestrating the cover-up to protect her upcoming municipal infrastructure commissioner campaign. Evelyn pointed to my coat rack, instructing me to grab my keys, while Arthur stood by the window, calculating the political liability. They treated me like a disposable shield, a convenient asset to be liquidated to save their golden investment. I did not panic. I did not ask why they were willing to sacrifice my freedom for her ambition. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I analyzed the situation as a simple balance sheet, noting how effortlessly they operated within the trap of cruel normalization. This is a specific psychological mechanism where toxic families condition a scapegoat to accept extreme exploitation as a standard family duty. By consistently framing Savannah's needs as absolute emergencies and my boundaries as selfish betrayals, they had normalized the unthinkable. It was no longer a shocking request to ask me to take the fall for a felony. In their minds, my destruction was just the cost of doing business to keep their favorite subsidiary afloat. They had spent decades lowering the bar for basic human decency, transforming manipulation into standard operating procedure. The transaction was clear. I trade my future to subsidize her fraudulent success. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones, assigning me motives and crafting my confession. Arthur decided I had been driving the SUV because my own car was in the shop, a lie he fabricated within 30 seconds of entering my home. Evelyn added that I'd panicked after hitting the pedestrian because I was an irresponsible, anxious person. They weren't shocked by what Savannah had done. They were entirely focused on damage control, rewriting reality to ensure the campaign remained untouched. They expected me to nod, to accept the liability, and to absorb the devastating consequences. They treated my silence as compliance. I watched them draft my prison sentence. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I just stood in the center of the room and observed the mechanics of their corruption. The cruel normalization had worked flawlessly on them, blinding them to the reality that they were committing obstruction of justice right in my living room. They believed I was the weak link, the family dropout who would fold under pressure. They thought I lacked the leverage to negotiate a better deal. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. I was no longer a silent partner in this toxic enterprise. I was preparing for a hostile takeover. I stood completely still, letting them lay out their fraudulent blueprint. They detailed how they would hire an attorney to represent me, someone who would carefully guide my false confession to ensure I received a minimum sentence. They were literally budgeting for my incarceration. Every word they spoke added another charge to my mental ledger. They were so confident in their authority, so insulated by their own manufactured reality, that they failed to recognize the shift in my demeanor. I was auditing their entire existence. For 20 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for their emotional and financial stability while receiving zero return. I was the designated family dropout, while Evelyn and Arthur funneled every resource, connection, and piece of praise into Savannah's political ascent. I quietly worked my way through rigorous federal clerkships and high-stakes corruption prosecutions. They viewed my discreet government career as a lackluster consolation prize, oblivious to the institutional power I wielded. They saw Savannah's municipal campaign as a blue-chip stock, pouring all their capital into her polished, empty facade. This dynamic forced me to carry the invisible chain of the survivor. It is a psychological burden where the overlooked child works relentlessly to achieve undeniable competence, yet remains tethered to the family's false narrative of their inadequacy. To survive the constant devaluation, The scapegoat builds an impenetrable fortress of independence. However, the invisible chain dictates that no matter how much external success I achieved, my primary function in their ecosystem was to be the designated loser. The contrast needed to make Savannah shine brighter. They needed me to be weak, so their investment in her appeared justified. This chain does not break through negotiation or tearful pleas. It shatters only when the survivor realizes the currency they seek from their family is entirely counterfeit. I recognized the chain wrapping around my ankles as Arthur paced my living room, confidently assuming I would trade my hard-earned life to cover Savannah's hit and run. I had spent 2 decades auditing corrupt officials, tracking illicit funds, and dismantling criminal enterprises. My parents were unaware that they had just walked into the home of a federal specialist trained to obliterate people exactly like them. They had spent my entire life underestimating my intellect, treating my quiet diligence as a lack of ambition. In reality, my silence was methodical. I had spent my career dealing in facts, evidence, and undeniable truth, utilizing analytical frameworks as rigid as File 1 Piation, Take Spun Guk, PDF, while they trafficked in favors, optics, and political spin. As Evelyn adjusted Savannah's collar, whispering reassurances to the woman who had just left a human being bleeding in the street, I reviewed the historical data. Every canceled graduation dinner, every ignored promotion, every time they diverted funds from my college tuition to fund Savannah's internships. It wasn't a series of unfortunate mistakes. It was a calculated embezzlement of parental support. I didn't feel despair over the realization. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. The invisible chain dissolved completely. I owed them absolutely nothing. They had come to my door demanding a sacrificial lamb, completely blind to the reality that they were dealing with the ultimate predator in their current legal predicament. My independence was absolute, and my retaliation would be legally flawless. I remained silent, letting them accumulate more liability. Their absolute certainty that I would agree to this criminal conspiracy was offensive, yet highly informative. It confirmed that their assessment of my worth had never evolved. They still saw the quiet teenager they could manipulate, completely failing to recognize the disciplined adult standing before them. The audit was nearly complete, and the penalty for their 20 years of negligence was about to be assessed in full. At 2:45 in the morning, the apartment door swung open again. Julian Cross, Savannah's campaign director, walked in. He was a ruthless political fixer, known for managing crises with a terrifying lack of morality. He was out of breath, clutching a briefcase, and sporting a fresh, bleeding laceration across his knuckles, undoubtedly from dealing with the physical aftermath of the shattered headlight. He didn't even acknowledge me as a human being. He treated me as a minor logistical hurdle. Julian immediately dropped his briefcase onto my kitchen island and pulled out a freshly printed, rehearsed script. The sheer efficiency of their operation was staggering. Within 30 minutes of a violent crime, the entire inner circle had assembled to construct coordinated false statements, delete digital trails, and frame me without a single shred of remorse. Julian handed me a piece of paper. He outlined exactly what I would say to the detectives. I would claim I borrowed Savannah's vehicle to buy late-night groceries, hit something in the dark, panicked, and drove home. He even brought a duplicate set of keys, instructing me to place my fingerprints on them. I watched the 3 of them, Evelyn, Arthur, and Julian, operate like a well-oiled corporate machine, engaged in massive fraud. Savannah sat on my sofa, sipping water, playing the fragile victim. The stakes were no longer about simple family favoritism. This was a coordinated criminal conspiracy. They were actively tampering with physical evidence, suborning perjury, and attempting to pervert the course of justice to protect a political campaign. I analyzed the language Julian used. It was purely transactional. He offered to cover my legal fees and promised to set up a discreet consulting job for me after my probation ended, as if a felony conviction was just a temporary dip in my credit score. I didn't argue. I didn't point out the ethical bankruptcy of their plan. I just watched Julian wipe the blood from his knuckles with one of my kitchen towels, disposing of evidence in my own home. My anger wasn't loud. It was precise, targeted, and clinical. They believed they were writing the script for my destruction, failing to realize they were providing me with a masterclass in their own criminal intent. I did not ask why they were doing this. The motivation was clear: institutional power and political survival. They were entirely unrepentant. Savannah didn't ask if the person she hit was alive. Evelyn didn't express horror at the crime. Arthur only focused on polling numbers. Julian just wanted the narrative contained before the morning news cycle. They were bankrupt entities, morally and legally insolvent. I didn't break down or yell. I stood quietly near the hallway, letting them firmly establish their guilt. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I was about to foreclose on their entire operation. I just needed to let them finish digging the grave. Every word they spoke was another nail, and I was holding the hammer. While my family assigned roles and drafted fake timelines on my kitchen counter, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an automated security confirmation from Marcus Hale, the judicial security officer assigned to my federal detail. The notification was brief and entirely encrypted, confirming that the high-definition interior audio and video feeds from my apartment's federal security system were actively locked onto a secure government server. When I had moved into this building, the United States Marshals Service had installed military-grade surveillance due to the nature of my work. The cameras were discreetly embedded in the crown molding, designed to protect a federal officer from cartel retaliation or political assassination. Tonight, they were recording a domestic conspiracy. Every word Evelyn uttered about covering up the hit and run, every instruction Julian gave regarding fingerprint placement, and every admission Savannah made about fleeing the scene was captured in crystal clear audio and instantly uploaded to an impenetrable federal database. But the security net extended beyond my living room. Savannah had parked her damaged SUV in my designated, federally monitored parking space. The exterior cameras had already captured her exiting the driver's side, wiping the bumper, and rushing into the building. Furthermore, the federal system automatically pinged local law enforcement databases, syncing the timeline of the reported hit and run with Savannah's arrival. The evidence was absolute, pristine, and entirely out of their reach. I watched Arthur draw a map of the intersection where the accident occurred, instructing me on how to describe the impact. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so convinced of their superiority, that they never once considered my actual operational capacity. I was a silent investor no more. I held the digital keys to their total destruction. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely, though they remained blissfully ignorant. I didn't show panic. I didn't hesitate. I calmly reviewed the security confirmation on my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. My retaliation was proactive, not reactive. The encrypted cloud evidence was secure, legally admissible, and devastating. Julian tapped his pen against the island, demanding I review the script. I looked at the paper, then looked at the four of them. They were demanding a signature on a fraudulent contract. I evaluated the assets they believed they controlled: political leverage, wealth, and family loyalty. All of it was worthless against the weight of federal jurisdiction. I didn't rub my eyes trying to summon regret. There was only the cold, hard clarity of the law. I stepped away from the kitchen island, leaving their fabricated timeline untouched. I walked slowly toward the closed double doors of my private home office. The time for observation had concluded. The audit was complete. It was time to issue the final judgment. The sheer magnitude of their miscalculation was almost beautiful in its precision. They had walked into a federal fortress, attempting to execute a municipal cover-up. Every frantic whisper, every deleted text message Julian bragged about was meticulously logged. I felt a surge of cold, decisive control. They were shocked by what they had done, but they were about to be absolutely devastated by what I possessed. I reached for the brass handle of my office door, ready to execute the pivot. "Where are you going?" Arthur snapped, his voice sharp with irritation as I stepped away from the kitchen. "We don't have time for you to panic, Victoria. Read the statement." Evelyn marched forward, her hand outstretched to seize my phone. She operated under the assumption that she could simply confiscate my communication, cutting off my ability to reject their terms. "Give me the phone. You're not calling anyone. We control this narrative now." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I sidestepped her grasping hand with clinical precision, grasped the heavy brass handles of my private office doors, and pushed them wide open. The lights inside automatically flickered to life, illuminating the room in a harsh, unforgiving glow. I didn't say a word. I simply stepped aside and let the architecture of my reality deliver the fatal blow. Mounted directly in the center of the mahogany-paneled wall, illuminated by a dedicated spotlight, was my commission. It was framed in heavy federal gold, bearing the seal of the United States of America. It clearly and undeniably stated my name and my title, United States Magistrate Judge. Draped meticulously over the leather chair beneath it was my black judicial robe. The silence that slammed into the room was absolute. It was the sound of a completely fabricated reality shattering into a million irreparable pieces. My family had spent 20 years treating me as an irrelevant clerk, deliberately ignoring the specifics of my career to maintain their narrative of my failure. They had never visited my home. They had never asked about my promotions. They had no idea I had been appointed to the federal bench. Arthur's face drained of color, his skin turning a sickly, ashen gray. Evelyn's outstretched hand slowly dropped to her side, her eyes wide with a sudden, suffocating terror. Julian, the ruthless political fixer, actually took a physical step backward, the blood draining from his face as he realized the magnitude of his error. Savannah dropped her glass of water. It shattered against the hardwood floor, a sharp, violent sound that mirrored the destruction of her political future. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I'd stopped playing along with their delusion. They had literally broken into the home of a sitting federal judge to solicit perjury and orchestrate the cover-up of a violent felony. They had laid out their entire criminal conspiracy in front of a federal officer in a federally monitored residence. I looked at Savannah, then at my parents. The power reversal was instantaneous and total. I didn't offer a smirk or a dramatic monologue. My anger wasn't loud. It was the cold, heavy weight of a gavel striking wood. "You are currently standing in a federally monitored location," I stated, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Every word you have spoken since 2:17 this morning has been recorded and uploaded to a secure judicial server." I watched the realization crush them. The illusion of their control evaporated in a single breath. Before Julian could lunge for the door, my attorney, Rebecca Shaw, stepped out of my office. She had been on a secure line, listening to the entire feed, legally logging the conspiracy in real time. She held up her phone, locking down the legal protocols as the distant, approaching wail of police sirens pierced the night air. I had triggered the silent alarm the moment Savannah confessed to the hit and run. The detectives arrived less than 3 minutes later, flooding the hallway. Savannah immediately pivoted to her rehearsed lies, weeping and pointing a shaking finger at me, claiming I had stolen her car. But Rebecca calmly handed a secured tablet to the lead detective. She played the encrypted audio footage, starting from the moment Savannah stood on my porch holding her keys, followed by the undeniable, high-definition footage of Savannah drinking from a silver flask inside the SUV moments before the collision. This is the absolute illusion of power from an empty wallet. People like my parents and Savannah operate under the delusion that social status, political connections, and performative wealth grant them immunity from the consequences of reality. They believe their curated image acts as a shield against the law, but their power is entirely counterfeit. It is an empty wallet, devoid of any real currency or institutional weight. When confronted with hard, undeniable metrics, federal evidence, encrypted data, and the unrelenting machinery of the justice system, their superficial power collapses instantly. They attempt to purchase their way out of accountability, using a currency that the legal system simply does not recognize. They were bankrupt entities trying to bribe a federal vault. The execution of judgment was swift and merciless. Savannah's initial lies to the police backfired catastrophically. The audio of her admitting to the crime, coupled with the footage of her intoxication and Julian's active conspiracy to suborn perjury, triggered immediate, non-bailable arrests. Detectives cuffed Savannah, her designer dress wrinkling as she was marched out of my apartment in disgrace. Julian was arrested for obstruction and tampering with evidence. Evelyn and Arthur were detained for questioning regarding their role in the conspiracy. I watched my parents, the elite political fixers of Charleston, being escorted out by local police. Their social standing, their carefully manicured reputation, and their decades of arrogance were ruined in exactly 12 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why it had to come to this. I just opened my laptop, forwarded the remaining encrypted files to the district attorney, and authorized Rebecca to handle the press. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. Their political campaign was instantly terminated. Their social ruin was absolute. The ledger was finally balanced, and their account was permanently liquidated. I felt no panic, no despair. Action begins immediately after the trigger, and my retaliation was complete. The detectives processed the crime scene with clinical efficiency, tagging Julian's discarded script as Exhibit A. Savannah's sobbing echoed down the hallway, a pathetic soundtrack to her total collapse. The illusion had been shattered, exposing the rot underneath. I stood in the center of my apartment, my breathing steady and my mind exceptionally clear. They had tried to exploit my silence, unaware that my silence was the very mechanism used to build their cages. The justice system was now in motion, and no amount of municipal political influence could stop a federal indictment. The fallout was absolute and irrevocable. Savannah was indicted on multiple felony charges, including fleeing the scene of an accident, causing severe bodily injury, and driving under the influence. Julian's career was destroyed, his political agency dismantled by federal obstruction charges. Evelyn and Arthur faced severe legal and social repercussions. Their country club memberships were revoked, their political allies vanished overnight, and they were publicly disgraced, forever tied to the orchestrated cover-up. After a formal ethics review confirmed I had acted with absolute propriety, I returned to the federal bench. I relocated my United States Magistrate Judge commission from the private office of my old apartment to the grand, brightly lit entryway of my new home. It hangs there as a permanent, undeniable statement of authority and boundaries. My family attempted to reach out through intermediaries, sending letters demanding healing and forgiveness without offering a single ounce of genuine accountability. They wanted to sweep the felony and the betrayal under the rug to restore their broken image. I rejected their manipulative demands firmly and completely. I did not engage in negotiations. I simply instructed Rebecca to issue cease and desist orders. I had been the silent investor in their toxic enterprise for far too long, and I was officially closing the account. I've come to realize that loyalty should never require you to sacrifice your own morality or freedom. The blood in our veins does not excuse the venom in their actions. I spent 20 years believing my quiet diligence would eventually earn me a seat at their table, only to discover that the table was rotten to its core. I chose personal integrity over their fraudulent peace. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from a debt you never owed. I walked away from their toxic manipulation and found absolute clarity in the law and in my own strength. You do not have to endure the cruel normalization of a family that views your existence as a liability. You have the right to enforce your boundaries with ruthless precision and protect the life you have built. I am no longer the family dropout. I am the architect of my own justice. I've come to realize that establishing boundaries is the most profound form of self-preservation. I stopped negotiating for a love that was always conditional, and in doing so, I reclaimed my own future. When you finally stop trying to prove your worth to people committed to misunderstanding you, the world opens up in extraordinary ways. The silence in my new home is no longer a symbol of being overlooked. It is the sound of absolute peace. The gavel has fallen on my past, and I am the only one presiding over my future. So, tell me honestly, if you were Victoria, would you protect your sister, protect yourself, or protect the truth? And what price would you be willing to pay? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and remember to subscribe for more deep dives into human nature and justice. Thank you for watching.